Greetings and welcome. My name is Aaron Craig with Let'sLearnThisTogether.com, the best place to learn game design and development with GameMaker Studio. Check out my website for my 3-course bundle to take beginners to experts in no time at all. In this tutorial, we're going to be covering 2 really big topics. The first one is going to be drop-in and drop-out support with controllers. So I've actually got 4 Xbox controllers here. You're going to be able to use any kind of controller as long as GameMaker can read it. And I'm going to show you how to detect when they are plugged in, to do something with that, and detect when they are unplugged and how to handle that. And then we're going to tackle 4-player split screen. You're going to be able to add players as the game goes, cameras get created dynamically, take players away, and cameras get destroyed dynamically. This is going to be really cool, but by far the longest in this series. If this is where you're just starting, then I highly encourage you to go back to the beginning of this camera series and watch it from there, because this is going to include everything we've learned and more. If you're already comfortable with controller support, then you can jump to about the 18-minute mark where I start handling just the camera code. But with that all being said, let's go ahead and jump into the 4-player drop-in, drop-out split screen tutorial. I'm excited, I hope you are too. Alright, it's time to tackle 4-player split screen drop-in, drop-out with controllers. Now, this is going to be a longer video because there's actually a lot to cover here, much more than just doing the camera work. And that's because we have to be able to identify when controllers are added, modify the cameras for that, identify when the controllers are removed, and then modify it for that. So let's get started because there's a lot here. I have a basic project here with just 4 different player sprites, a background, 2 objects with no code, and the only object in the room right now is the camera. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to teach you how to find the controller added event. So this is actually under add event, asynchronous system. So if you have not used async or system events before, then this is probably going to be a little confusing for you. But essentially, async stands for asynchronous, which means that it happens independently of other things. So the things in here, this event can get triggered by outside sources from your game. And you want that because this is going to pick up when a controller is detected. So whether you're using Xbox or PC or whatever, this will know when a controller gets put in and when it gets taken out, and then you can do something when that happens, independent on when it occurs. So the main thing that we're going to look at here is this async load built-in variable. So this is actually a DS map, which holds all of the asynchronous events that can occur when they occur. So we're going to read this like a DS map, and the asynchronous events that you can have, well, there's quite a few here. The one we're going to be looking at specifically is under System, because you can do gamepads, virtual keyboards, Xbox Live, and audio system status, which I'm not going to worry about that. We want to look at gamepads. So when we plug in or unplug a gamepad, async load gets an event type filled up, and it has either the gamepad discovered or gamepad lost. And either one, we're going to have a pad index variable in there that's going to know which one was added or removed. So let's take a look at how to actually use that so we can detect when controllers get loaded in. So remember, this is a DS map, and there are 2 ways to get values from a DS map. I'll do the first one, which is a little bit easier first. So I'm just going to say show message so we can read what this does. And we're going to do DS map find value. The DS map is async load, and the value that we're looking for is event type. So now, if I run this because my camera is in the room and I have a controller plugged in, let's see what comes up. Audio system status. And that's all. So audio system status, if you remember, was one of those things, but we didn't want to deal with that. Now, that happens every single time because it lets you know what's going on with the audio in your game and it adjusts it appropriately. But we didn't get anything for a gamepad, even though I do have a gamepad plugged in. The reason for that is it actually tells you that This event will not be triggered unless there's at least one gamepad function somewhere in your game code. It doesn't have to have run yet, but you have to actually have the code in your game. Otherwise, it just disables those events completely. So let's go to the OBJ player. I'm just going to say create. I'm just going to say gamepad set axis dead zone. We'll just say 0 and 0.25 for now. Gamepad axis dead zone just means that it's not actually going to start giving you a value until that value is greater than 0.25. This is good for avoiding drift. But this is a function, a gamepad function, so now when we run this, we'll get the gamepad detected. Gamepad discovered. Voila. So now we found it. Now we need to figure out how to actually get something more from it. And I'm going to show you the other way of accessing it because it's a little bit faster. And it looks like this. You just type in the name of the DS map, you put it in a bracket like an array, you put a question mark, that's what it is specifically for DS maps. If you're doing it for a DS list or a grid, it's a different symbol, but for maps, it's just a question mark. That's all it is, just to indicate that this is a DS map. And then we type in event type, just like we had before, close the bracket, and if we run it again, it's going to do the exact same thing. Gamepad discovered, audio system status. So I'm going to use this because it's a lot faster than having to type out the actual function dsmap find value. I just wanted to show you that first. Now, I'm going to say if the async load event type is equal to, I'm going to copy this gamepad discovered exactly. That way I don't make any mistakes. It's unfortunate that they're in strings. It'd be nicer if they were macros or built-in constants, but they're not. At least not for this version. So now we know when we have discovered a gamepad, we're inside of here, and now we can do something. So we want to get the ID of what we just did. So I'm going to say gamepad ID equals async load, and now we're going to access the pad index. And that will store the ID of what we just used here, what we just got. So now we know which gamepad we have. Because we're going to be doing up to 4 gamepads, we need to make sure that we get the correct value, and eventually we're going to assign it to the OBJ player, and that way each one is controlled by just one gamepad, and it always knows which one it is, so you can drop in and drop out any time, as long as you update this appropriately and destroy the appropriate object, the specific instance, when they leave, which is how we're going to be handling it. So this is now what we want. So I'm going to do another show message just to take a look and show you what it is. So I'm going to do this, and I have another couple controllers here. I actually have 4. So the first one we get is 0. Now, while we're running the game, if I plug in another controller, that is actually going to pop up. Now we have 2 controllers plugged in. So I'm going to unplug that one and put it back over there. So you can see that this picks up how many controllers we have. So now what I want to do is go into the OBJ player and set up some of the variables inside of here. I'm going to actually delete that function because I don't want it inside of the player. We're going to put it somewhere else. But I do need to store the pad ID, and we're going to do that when we create this. Because you notice that we have no objects besides the camera in here, because the camera is actually going to take care of creating the players as we connect controllers. Now that might not be what you actually want to do in your game, but I figure that this is the more complex way. So if we do it this way, then you can figure out how to do it your way because it'll be a little bit simpler. I want to be able to move around, so I'm going to set a move speed equal to 5. I'm going to have a couple different sprites in here, so I'm just going to set this up right now. So my sprites 0 equals SPR player 1. Copy this. Oop. Then I'm just going to change these over to 1, 2, and 3, and then these to 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to show you how to use these and be able to move between them as well. Then I'm just going to have a variable called mySprite equal to 0, and then I'm going to set sprite index equals mySprites, mySprite, voila. Now it gets set. You could easily just put this to a random number as well. So a random range between 0 and 3. Doesn't really matter too much. We're going to be able to change these eventually. Now, we have a pad ID, and that's what we're actually going to use when we move around in the game. So I'm going to add a step event. And that's because the pad ID is required when you're moving and using the controller input. So I'm going to create a variable called x-axis, set it equal to gamepad axis value, pad ID, which we're going to set in a little bit, but we're going to know which controller we're actually receiving input from. And then we're going to do GP axis LH. So if you're familiar with gamepad input, which I assume you are, if not, check out my other tutorials, we have the x-axis, which stands for horizontal. So that's why the left stick here horizontally. Now I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to say this is y-axis, and I'm going to put this to V for vertical. So now we can move around, and then I'm going to set up being able to change the sprites. So I'm going to set right bumper equal to game pad button check pressed pad ID GP shoulder R. Then I'm going to copy that, change it to left bumper and shoulder L. So now we have all 4 of these controls that I want to be able to do. To be able to actually move around, I'm going to say x plus equals x-axis times our move speed, y plus equal y-axis times move speed. And that should take care of being able to actually move around. Now, before we can test this out though, I'm going to come into OBJ camera. And when we detect a new gamepad, what I want to do is create a new player and then set the ID for that player when we create them. So I'm going to say with instance create layer, room width divided by 2, room height divided by 2, instances obj player. So inside of here, I'm creating them. I'm going to set their ID, and I'm going to set it equal to this. So I'm actually just going to cut this out and say pad ID equals that. Don't need to do gamepad ID anymore. Then I'm also going to set the dead zone here. Gamepad axis, gamepad set axis dead zone. For this one, pad ID, which we already have, and 0.25. All right, now we have created the player, set the ID, and set the dead zone. So if we run this, the first time it gets discovered, it will create a player right in the middle of the room, and we can move around. And that's basically all I want to be able to do. Now, I do want to be able to distinguish between our players. So I'm going to set up down here, just if right bumper gets pressed, or if left bumper, we're going to be able to change sprites. I'm just going to say my sprite equals clamp, my sprite plus 1. Minimum is 0, and the maximum is going to be the array length 1D of the variable my sprites that we have right here, minus 1. And that will clamp it, so we can only go one way. And then we're going to do the same thing here, but we're going to go down. My sprite minus 1, 0, array length 1D of my sprites minus 1. And then don't forget to set sprite index, otherwise it won't do anything. So sprite index equals my sprites, my sprite. Ooh. Copy that, put it there, run our game. Now we should be able to change sprites. There we go. So this will just help us distinguish when we actually have multiple players on the screen, which one is which. So that's all that we need to do inside of the player itself. They're not actually going to do a whole lot more than that. All the other logic I want to take care of is going to be in the camera. So the next thing we're going to do here is actually set up when we have a removed gamepad. So right now, this one, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this. This is when we add a gamepad. Now we need to check it if it's removed. But I'm just going to go ahead and copy this first if statement, put it down here, and I want to go to the help menu and just this says gamepad lost. So I'm just going to do that. And then we'll come back to this in a little bit because we're going to have this one actually take care of destroying players when they leave the game, and this one takes care of adding them. But for now, we need to actually go in and set up the camera create event. And all we need to do in here is just set view enabled equal to true. And we're going to create a global.cameras array, which we're going to initialize as undefined. So this is going to be an array of cameras that we have in the game, but I want it to start as undefined because we're going to mess around with it later and be able to create and destroy cameras as players drop in and drop out. Now this is where it's going to get kind of confusing. I'm going to go ahead and create a script called create cameras. And this script is actually what we're going to run every single time something happens in here. So whenever we add a new player, I'm going to say create cameras. And we're going to create the cameras, but we're going to redo them every single time. And that's because when we have one player, the loadout for the cameras is vastly different than when we have 2, 3, or 4. Same thing for all of them. So each time, we're actually going to destroy all of the cameras we have and recreate all of them. Now, it happens on the same frame, so you don't actually notice anything different. The cameras just change, and it's awesome. So let's come into the script, because this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time here. So create all the cameras. And so we're going to get the amount of players that we have first, which is going to be instance number, obj players. Before we get too far in here, I'm going to go back into the workspace in the camera and write down in the create, when the discover event here, I want to call create cameras, because we're going to update this every single time. Same thing down here. We're going to do some code before to actually delete one of the players that we have, but I do want to actually do that every single time we discover a new camera. And we can actually take care of this code right now. So we've already assigned the pad ID to whichever player is currently connected to it. So now, when we want to get rid of it, we just have to go through and find the one that matches the ID inside of this async load event. So I'm going to say var controller ID equals async load pad index. So we're going to get which one it is. Then we're going to do a for loop. I is less than instance number of obj player and plus plus I. Let's see if I can bring this closer to the center. Okay, so we're going to go through all of the players that are out there and find the one that matches our controller ID. So if instance find obj player I dot pad ID is equal to controller ID, then we're going to destroy it. Instance destroy, instance find, we have to find it again, obj player I, and then we're going to break out. Then we can create the cameras after we've updated that. So that's all we have to do in the async event as well, and in the create event. So the last thing to tackle is going to be this create camera script, which, granted, is where most of the complexity resides, but that's okay. We've gotten this far. Let's just run the game, make sure that it works fine. I still have one controller plugged in. I can move around. Okay, we're good. So now we need to create all of the cameras that we have, but each time we might have a different amount of cameras, but that's okay because we know based on player count. So each camera is going to have some things in common. So I'm going to say var width equals 960, height of 540, scale of 1.5. Those are the default properties that we're going to be using. Now when we come in here, we might already have cameras. And if that's the case, we want to destroy them, not just override them. Otherwise, we'll get a memory leak and your game will eventually crash. So we're going to check to see if global.cameras is undefined. And if it is not, that means there's at least one camera in that array. So we're going to go through it. I is less than the array length of that. And we just use the function camera destroy global.cameras I. And then we come down here and we're going to reset that. Global.cameras equals undefined. So we destroy cameras, taking care of any memory leaks, and then we reset it to undefined so that we can come in here and then fix it back up. Now, this project is going to have up to 4 different players. That means that we can have up to 4 different views visible at once. So whenever we come in here, I'm going to set all of those views to false. So view visible 0 equals false. Copy this. 1, 2, 3. So this is going to make sure that we don't have any views lingering around when we disconnect controllers. I'm going to press enter a lot and then come up here. Now we're going to do a for loop where I is less than our player count. And this is where most of the magic is going to happen. We're going to make all of the cameras here and set all of the properties each time depending on how many players there are. So first we're going to get the player. Player equals instance find obj player I. And this is going to be fine even though there's multiple players. I don't need to necessarily know which one it is specifically. If you want to make sure that your camera always finds the exact same player and that the first player always goes to the top left screen, then you'll want to create a global array or just an array in the camera that holds which instance is in which order, and then you just do that. This, I think, works totally fine for me, and in all my testing, it always seems to work exactly the same, so it always puts the players that I expect to where they expect, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. Then we're going to set the specific view we're in equal to true. Now we're going to make the camera. So global.cameras I equals camera, create view 0, 0, width divided by 1.25, height divided by 1.25, and these are simply because I think it looks really nice like that. There's no specific math reason or programming reason that you have to divide it by 1.25. I just think that looks good. So we're going to say angle of 0. We're going to follow that player, -1 and -1 to the speeds, and a width and a height for the border speed so that you're always moving around well. Then we set the camera we create. View set camera I global.cameras I. So we create it, we set it. Now here comes the tricky part for having multiple players. You have to take into account each of the different circumstances that you can have. So you can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 players, and you have to manually set every single view depending on which one that actually is. So let's get to it. Once you understand how to do this, this is the tricky part. This part is what took me a very long time to finally understand. But once you get it, then you can have as many or as few players as you want. So we're going to start when I is equal to 0. When that's the case, there's at least 1 player. So if there's 1 player, then this is the code that we're going to use. I'm going to show you how to do this by using the built-in properties, and then I'm going to show you functions for the rest of them. So view export 0 or I, it's going to be the same thing here, equals 0. View y port I equals 0. View w port 0 equals the width. And view h port 0 equals the height. These I'm switching between, but they really don't matter. So if we ran this right now, it would actually work. It's going to look a little warped, but that's okay. I'll explain why. But right now, the camera is set up and it's following us around exactly as we would expect. So the export that we have here is how far over that view in our game, let me bring it up again, how far over the view in our game should be in relation to this window. I want it to start in the top left corner because there's only 1, and then I want it to be the width and the height of whichever the full camera is. So it's going to be covering everything here. Now once we add another one here, we're going to cut it right down the middle. So our height is going to be divided by 2. So the H port will be 2, and then we'll have to actually set the camera view size to be a little bit different so that it's not warped there either. So the reason it's warped right now is that we haven't resized the window and the application surface. So if we come down here after all this, if I say window set size, width times scale, and height times scale, and then surface resize to application surface, width times scale, and height times scale. Now it's going to look just fine. There we go. Okay, so that's just taking care of making sure that looks good. Now, when I was going through this, I did run into a lot of issues. And most of those issues are having things be skewed a little bit incorrectly, or maybe I set the X or the Y port off to a wrong spot, and so it was really strange. I'm going to try and show you some of those errors and what the values need to be so that they actually look good. Now, we're going to go into two-player mode here. So if there's two players, I wanted to split it horizontally down the screen because I already did a vertical split in the other two-player split screen video. So on this one, we need to reset both. I'm going to do that with functions here. View set export. So this is just setting our export just like that. 0. And we're going to leave the first one. So the first viewport, which is the first player, is going to be in the top left screen. So 0, 0. I'm going to set the Y port as well, though, and that is going to be 0, 0. So it's still in the top left. Now, the reason we're setting it, even though it hasn't changed, is that in the second and third player, or third and fourth player, it might change. So when moving down, we have to make sure that we update this properly as well, not just going up. That's why we have to redo everything. Now we're going to do view set W port 0. It's still going to be width. But when we set the H port, now since we've cut it in half, I'm going to do height divided by 2. And the reason I'm using functions here as opposed to this is simply because it's a little bit quicker to type out once you get used to it. And they're probably the better way to go. I don't know that for sure, but using a function like this decouples the logic, which is good. That way, if GameMaker ever says, hey, I don't want you using these anymore, they won't break your project. So that's why I'm using them, and that's why you probably should as well. So then, after we update all of that one, we're going to do camera, set view size, global.cameras 0, since that's the one we're messing with here, width, and height divided by 2. If you don't do this, then your camera is going to be skewed and it's going to look weird. All right, I'll show you that in just a second. Now I'm going to copy this and put it here. I'm going to change all of these to 1s because now we're messing with the second viewport. And for the most part, it's very similar, except that we want it to be displayed halfway down the actual screen. So I'm going to say height divided by 2. Then I'm going to run it. Now, if you don't have a second controller, then nothing will have changed. But if I plug in my second controller now, there we go. Now I've got two players that I can move around independent, and each one has its own camera, which is really, really cool. And if I unplug it, it goes right back to one player. Super neat, in my opinion. Now let's take a look at what happens if we do some of these wrong. So if you don't update the camera views, we'll run it again. I'll plug in my second controller. Actually, I'll just leave it plugged in now. And now you can see, well, they're kind of messed up. They're very squashed. And that's because the height that we're actually displaying it at has been cut in half because there's two players on the screen, but we didn't tell the camera, hey, the height is cut in half, so make sure you adjust that. So you have to have that. Now, if we move the export in the wrong area, let's say we move this down 500 instead of the actual value it's supposed to be, then this is the second player, and there's a big space in between because it's messed up now. So that's what happens if you mess up the Y port. If you mess up the X port, it goes on the X-axis over. And so now there's space on the sides. So there's actually part of the camera off of the viewport that you can't see over there, which isn't good. So X port and Y port are where they actually show up in the game window itself. W and H port are the width and height of what you're displaying. and you have to update the camera size to be the same as the width and the height port, otherwise you get distortion. That is kind of the key to this. Now, let's go on to the next one. If I is equal to 2. The nice thing is, I know how to do this, so I'm just going to copy this over. Copy one more down here, and I'll show you exactly how we're doing it. I'm leaving space in between so you can easily see which one is which. I'm going to update this last one to all 2s, and then let's walk through which ones actually change. Now, what I want to do for the first player is give them a big screen. Because now that we have 3 players on screen, we could either have a blank space in one of the corners over here, or we can leave the first player with the big screen and the other 2 get small screens. If you remember playing Halo or something back in the day, first player was always the coveted position because they got a bigger screen. Now, I'm going to make sure that you don't actually get to see more, so it's not like you're cheating and you get an advantage. They just get a larger section. It doesn't actually mean they get to see more of the game because the camera view is going to be the same. So the first one is going to stay up there. So I want it to be in the top left, so 0, 0. Width is still the same, height is still the same, so actually everything is still the same. Then we move on to the second player. Now this one is going to be down, right where it should be. Width, though, it now has to share width with someone, so it needs to be divided by 2, which means the camera view size has to be divided by 2. Now the export on the third player needs to be pushed over. So I'm going to do width divided by 2 on both of these and on that one. So now, if I run this and I grab my third controller and I plug it in, there we go. So now, that's 3 different players, and the first player has the big screen, exactly like we wanted. Awesome. I think that's looking really good. I'm going to leave all 3 controllers plugged in, and now we're going to go to the last controller. If I is equal to 3. So we're going to do the same thing basically here. Copy this, paste it in, copy one more for the fourth player, and add that one, set this one all to 3s. Okay, now the first player doesn't get a big screen, but they are still going to be right there in the top left corner, so we don't need to do anything about that, besides cut their width in half since they actually have to share part of their screen. So update that one. Now the second player is going to get moved to the top right. So the export on that is going to be pushed over by the amount of width divided by 2. And the Y port is going to be 0 since we want it to be on the top. Now down here, everything else on the second player stays the same. Third player is going to be in the bottom left corner. So we want the export to be 0. And the Y port stays the same and everything else does as well. Now the fourth player is going to be in the bottom right, so they're going to have all of that just like it already was, and that's everything we have to do. And now let's test this out. I'll plug in my last controller. So we go from 3 to 4, and it should add in one more, and there we go. We now have 4 players, 4 different cameras, all on the screen, looking great. Now if I unplug my fourth controller, it goes away exactly as you'd expect. If I unplug the first controller, it goes away and just leaves 2 more, just like that. So now you have drop in, drop out, multiplayer. The only thing you have to take into consideration is when you unplug all 4 controllers, all 4 views get disabled and you have nothing showing. So you'd probably want to have a special condition here, checking to see if instance number is equal to 0, and then take it to a menu or some kind of start screen, I'm guessing. But I'm not going to cover that because this has been long enough already. This is really cool though. I hope you appreciate it. I hope you get to use it in your projects and that awesome stuff comes of it. If you liked this video, please leave a like, leave a comment, let me know what you're thinking. I really appreciate it and it really helps me out. If you want to see even more content from me, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified of upcoming videos when they get released. If you want to see more courses from me, you can check out my website at letslearnthistogether.com, where you can find great content like this to take beginners to experts in GameMaker Studio. Come back every Monday and Friday morning for more videos from me. Thanks for tuning in, and as I always say, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later. A huge thank you to all of the awesome people who support me over on Patreon. Their names are on the screen now, and every dollar pledged helps me create more awesome content. You can support me for as little as $1 a month and get access to exclusive perks like my Discord server, your name in the credits, early access to my YouTube videos and courses, and more. Check it out at patreon.com/letslearnthistogether.com, or find the link in the description below and become a patron today.